Well, great evening, everyone. Good to see everybody again. I'm Karen Owen, adjunct faculty and director of strategic research at Hood Theological Seminary. Welcome to session 4, the critical race theory and the church, unpacking race and racism in religious spaces. Tonight's focus is on racism and theology via the continued facilitation by Hood Theological Seminary alum, Reverend Dr. Samuel Oliver Jr. This free course offering is presented via the Pathways for Tomorrow initiative of the Lilly Endowment Incorporated. Before we begin, as always, just a few reminders. We remain very grateful for the tremendous outpouring on this important subject. Therefore, we're going to ask that you please keep your devices muted throughout the session. As with previous sessions, the PowerPoint presentation slides, the recording, and the chat will be sent to you before the next session, which will occur in 2 weeks. And if you have questions, as we've been doing, please type them in the chat, questions or comments, so that Dr. Oliver can address them either tonight or in writing, which will also be sent to your email addresses. And I'd like to thank our president, Dr. Virgil Lattimore, Mr. John Everett, Kelly Bryant, and Mrs. Sandra Oliver for their valued assistance and support. There's a lot of work that occurs in the background to ensure the success of our programs. So welcome again, everyone. And I'll now turn it over to Dr. Oliver.
So good evening again, everyone. So good to glance at the Hollywood squares and see some familiar faces now that we were into week 4. I'm looking up and not having to actually look at names. I recognize some of these faces. So appreciate a lot of you for being diligent and hanging with us throughout the whole tenure of this course. And so tonight, as Dr. Owens mentioned, we're going to pick up and I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on seminar etiquette because Dr. Owens spent, I think, already mentioned, please just be mindful of muting your devices. But I always want to give a little bit of a caution to just to remind people, and we have not had any incidents, by the way, so I just want to clarify that. But I just want to make sure that people just be sensitive. We know this is a sensitive topic, and just be mindful of people's comments and be gracious to each other, is what I would ask. And here we are again, week 4, and we're going to be talking about racism and theology. And that's our schedule as outlined for the next 2 weeks. We only had 2 sessions after tonight's session. Next week, we will be not next week, but the next session, which is on November 6th, we are talking about how do we build a multicultural church community. So really starting to get into some of the implications of a lot of the things that we've been talking about for the last 4 weeks. And I do want to make an announcement here, so just so that you can, and I will update the chart. So week 6, I want to talk a little bit about week 6, which is our last session. And it's titled The Role of the Church in Social Justice. It is my goal to maybe look at combining week 6 discussion, or at least portion of it, into week 5. And why I want to do that is we're going to still have week 6 session, but I want to leave some time for some open dialogue in week 6. We've gotten some tremendous comments and good questions from class participants. And one of the challenges with doing something like this via Zoom is there isn't really ample opportunity, especially in a 1-hour class, to allow for free-flowing dialogue. So week 6, we are going to leave some time. And so I want you to keep that in mind, because some of you have posed some very good questions. You've shared some very interesting and great historical, personal perspectives. And I just feel like it might be us good to have an open dialogue in week 6. And so we're going to leave some time for that in week 6 as we go forward. So please mark your calendars accordingly and just know that we're going to try and build that in, okay? But tonight we're going to continue to build on what we've been doing for the last 3 weeks. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this chart talking about the tenets of critical race theory, but I do find it important. And please bear with me, especially those of you who've been with us from the beginning, because you see this and you go, well, Reverend Sam, why do we have to see this every week? Well, some people are joining us, believe it or not, in week 4 for the first time. And so I always feel it's important to give a little bit of context for what we're discussing and just allow people to have or refresh their memory on the 5 basic tenets of critical race theory. I'm not going to spend a lot of time. Racism is the exception, not the rule. We've talked quite a bit about the concept of interest conversion, which highlights the thought that, hey, when the people who are in the dominant majority, they seldom make change unless it's in their interest as well, hence the term interest conversion. We've talked extensively about the idea that race is a product of a social construct. There's nothing biological about race as we know it, particularly in America. It is something that was invented by man. And we've talked about the whole idea that people can exist in multiple categories of oppression. We've talked about how you could be a woman and a minority and experience oppression from both perspectives, and they call that intersectionality. And then the last thought of critical race theory is this idea of allowing people who are marginalized or who have been oppressed to have an input into shaping history and telling stories from their perspective, meaning that sometimes we're never going to get the full perspective, particularly within history, unless we account for the story and the perspective of the marginalized or the oppressed. And critical race theory refers to that as counter storytelling. So keep those thoughts in mind as we now drive down the road, and we're going to start our discussion tonight about race and theology. Excuse me. So when we talk about theology, we have to understand that there's this diverse perspective within the religious community when we talk about theology, which at its very core, theology is at its core the study of God and the tenets of God and how it plays into our religious beliefs, right? So if you keep that in mind, I think you can understand that we have this variance of interpretations when it comes to theology. And some of these are grounded in denominational beliefs. Some of this is grounded in the various religious traditions, but they all impact things such as justice, equality, and how we view individuals, both ourselves and others. So we can use examples from different faiths to illustrate how theology can influence attitudes, if you will, towards racial issues. We see this carried out in multiple ways. And so if we're going to talk about theology, we have to also understand that we have to explore how the different religious texts may be interpreted in different ways, and how these interpretations of the text, if you will, can influence and how they impact their stance on social justice. And that is a very, very true statement, I would argue, in America, because we are a country that is founded predominantly on Christian Judaism belief systems, but we have to account for a multitude of religions when we talk about the broader perspective of how religion impacts or theology, I should say, impacts race. So surely when we're talking tonight, we're going to be talking predominantly about the Christian perspective, but we cannot lose sight of the fact that in America, there is a pluralism of, religious faith that we have to account for, and they all don't align with Christian theology, right? And so we have to allow people to share their own experiences because of the theological diversity we have within our religious community. So just kind of setting the scope for how theology at the broadest level impacts or how it can impact race. If we take it to another level and start to think about theology in personal identity, and we talked a little bit about this in last week's session. But it has a very significant role to play on the individual level, right? How a person's worldview comes into formation. We're going to talk a little later on about one of the authors that I don't want to get too far ahead of myself, but there's one author that I'm using to underpin tonight's session who makes the statement that theology and a person's view of God is probably the most important thing that you can discern if you want to understand a person's worldview. So it plays a very key role in how people come into being and how they formulate who they are. It is a framework, as the slide says, for understanding, a lot of our basic questions that we have about life, what's our purpose in this world? How do we view mortality? What happens to us in the afterlife? All of these things stem from our personal theology perspective. So it's a very, very important concept to grasp when we talk about how it shapes and how it plays in who we are as individuals. So you see this in a lot of colleges, obviously, because theology is right up there with study of philosophy in understanding humanity and understanding who we are. Excuse me. Anyhow, I think you get the point. It's a significant component of who we are. And so the trick is, though, how intertwined is your theology into who you are? Because we can selectively take components of our theological understanding and we mesh them and we integrate them with other life experiences, right? So theology, while it's a very, very important aspect of who we are, it is not the only thing that defines who we are, right? We integrate them with other aspects of our identity to include our cultural background, our life experiences, certainly, influence of family and friends. All of these things have to be meshed together with our theological underpinning to really grasp our personal identity. Where it really starts to, I think, shape and come into play as it relates to what we have been talking about for the last 3 weeks is how theology impacts things such as morality and ethics. Morality and ethics, we all, I would submit, would subscribe to the belief that, we all have as personal beings some form of ethics. Some people argue that they're ingrained in the human nature of man. Certainly those of us who call ourselves believers or Christians would say that a big portion of our morality and ethics comes from our theological beliefs. And they provide a foundation for one's moral and ethical value. In other words, how you view your relationship with God should have an impact on how you then interact with society and how those shape your morals and your ethical value. And some of these vary, right? We talked about the variance already of theology across the various, the myriad of religious perspectives that we have in America. But some religious denominations, they have very discrete, prescribed, if you will, tenets about what is right, what is wrong. And they have a very, very strong influence on their sense of morality. I don't have to call out any particular denominations. If you've lived long enough, I'm sure you've encountered people where their religion can sometimes be the most dominating feature in how they go about making their life decisions, because their religion and their theology plays such a dominant role in their life that it becomes the lens through which a lot of people make their decisions. Okay. And we also understand that theology plays into this whole idea of purpose and meaning. Philosophy says we all grapple with this, right? What is the purpose of our life and why are we here? And you can get into some very interesting conversations, I'm sure you can imagine, if you just start to pose that question of people. But I would submit to you again that if you really start to dissect it, it's very interesting to see the dynamics, to see how theology often plays into how a lot of people address this question of why am I here? What is my purpose? So a person's belief about the divine nature and how their relationship is with that divine nature plays a huge part in shaping their understanding of their own purpose, their own existence, why we're here on earth. I'm sure at this point, I don't believe I'm telling you anything that you don't know, but I wanted to give you some context as we continue to walk down this road of race and theology, because they all factor into what we're going to eventually talk about. So we've talked about implications primarily from the personal level and how theology shapes and how it helps to form our morals, our ethics, how we view ourselves. But there's the social and cultural values that theology often also plays a big part in, right? What a society or what a culture considers normal, or what they accept as societal norms, a lot of times is intertwined with a predominant theology or theologies within a culture. And we're no different, obviously, in America. American history, we know that theology played a big part in formation of this country, with some of the thoughts that even predated the founding of America. A lot of those cultural norms stem from theology that came from Europe, along with the founding fathers of America. And so religious and theological teachings can influence how we formulate societal concepts such as family structure. Still one of the most, I would argue, debated concepts within Christianity is you start talking about the book of Ephesians and you start talking about the family structure as outlined by Paul, and you can find yourself in a very hotly debated debate, because our predominant theology of Christianity has some very definitive things to say, for example, about the family structure, about gender, about roles, social justice. Pretty much anything that you can kind of address in society, there is probably a lineage to something that comes from the Christian theology. And so those things help to formulate our societal norms about what we expect a family to look like, about what the roles are for different components of a family. all of this also influences how you think and your attitude towards others. So how and to the degree your theological underpinning is embedded in your individual worldview plays a very, very important part in how you interact with people, in particular with people who hold different beliefs than yours, right? Because if your religious beliefs and your theological underpinning is interpreted in a certain way, it can very much be the foundation by which you start to interact with other people, how you view them, how you think they view you, for example. So all of this speaks to things like tolerance, the lack thereof, or unfortunately, like I say, intolerance can be influenced by one's theological perspective. So all of these things with their grounding, their roots in the concept of theology are things that we have to account for when we talk about race and theology. Now, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this slide, but I just wanted to revisit this one because I had this slide in last week's session because we talked about race and personal identity. And I wanted to show the linkage between that personal identity and a little bit more in a discussion about how theology helps to underpin your personal identity. And so then we got to this discussion last week about, well, what is racism and how does it impact personal identity? And we talked about prejudice versus discrimination and how prejudice is just this prejudgment based upon superficial or what you deem to be someone's perspective. And all of us have prejudices, right? It's just built into human nature. We all make value-based decisions, or we make decisions based upon our life experiences, our cultural experiences, and we come up with these derived prejudgments based upon little or no actual experience, right? And then we talked about discrimination being that concept that when you start to now take action based upon prejudice, now we start to inch our way towards actual racism, because hatred is one of those emotions that can grow out of prejudice, which then can lead to discrimination. And so when prejudice causes you to act differently, we start to transition into discrimination. And then I made I'm going to go back one second. I made the definition as it of racism when couched within critical race theory is that it then becomes racism is when you systematically have the power and authority to put into place those discriminations, right? And so within critical race theory, the idea of racism kind of transcends from a personal perspective into a systematic or institutional concept, meaning that, racism comes about when there is power and the ability to affect discrimination. And I said last week, the critical race theory proponents would argue that, it's difficult, if not impossible, for Black people in America to exhibit systematic racism because most of the institutions and systemic vehicles are predominantly managed and owned by the white race in America. So I just wanted to revisit that real quickly. So going back then to say, okay, race and theology, and where does it come from, and how has it shown itself in American history? And we go back to slavery and racism. And we've talked about this in previous session. But if you look at slavery and Christianity in its origin, you had this dichotomy, right? you had this Christianity, which talked about the love of Christ and the fact that we're all created equal in the image of God. And yet you had white Christians who were proponents and executors, if you will, of slavery. So slavery and racism, when you looked at them in their purest form, could not coexist unless you had to radically alter one or the other. And so we had in American history this alteration of Christianity in order to kind of justify, if you will, this imperialistic European notion of Black inferiority, which we know is what was perpetuated during that time frame, and this whole Christian theme of love and freedom. And so, if you're familiar at all with Frederick Douglass in some of his writings, uh, just before the Civil War, he was very outspoken. Frederick Douglass, who was born into slavery and then worked his way into freedom, wrote extensively about this dichotomy. And he called Christianity, he referred to it as the slaveholding Christianity, because he could not bring himself to kind of rationalize how could this slave master who on Sundays, stand, or these slaveholders who, some of them who were in clergy, could stand up on Sunday and preach and teach about a loving God and then still be oppressive in chattel slavery at the same time. So they had to come up with some sort of rationalization, if you will, for slavery in theology. And in this case, again, we're talking about Christianity. And there was this, if you will, white Christ that kind of emerged from this dichotomy. And it did some things, like I said, it allowed, if you bought into this notion of Black inferiority and the fact that there was this white Christ who allowed for the justification of slavery and that Christians themselves could be slaves. All of this was done in an effort to help to underpin this dichotomy, if you will, right? And so Frederick Douglass, again, was very outspoken and talked about this. And it kind of fed into and it exposed this idea, if you will, that many Christians articulate their understanding and their experience of God through a lens that privileges white culture, white authors, and white institutions. Where am I going with that is, well, this idea of a white Christ, which was, by the way, perpetuated in symbology and a lot of things that are still prevalent in our society today, right? The rendering of Jesus Christ as, a Caucasian with blue eye and blonde hair was quite prevalent, and it still is in some circles, in American circles. And so anyhow, this underpinned a lot of the thinking, a lot of the teaching in institutions, in churches, etc., about Christianity. And so this is one of the things when we talk about theology in America that we have to navigate our way through. And so this interplay between cultural and religious experiences, like I've already talked about, can be a very, very profound aspect of one's identity. And we talked before about this whole idea of balancing multiple identities, and particularly from the African American perspective, you found, and we still find ourselves in some circles navigating the complexity of both being Black and being religious. And those things sometimes collide, if you will. And so you had then in the African American circles kind of this tension of how do I then come to rationalization between what we're going to talk about in more detail a little later, this whole idea of the liberating aspect, if you will, of Christianity and the racial injustice that coexisted. And so this does not seamlessly align with mainstream theological perspective within religious communities. And a lot of it goes back to what I was talking about on the previous slides when I said when the white Christianity was created to kind of address this dichotomy, it seeped into various segments of society. And like I said, this included institutions, and it certainly included churches, right? So you see race in theology now starting to come into play. This idea, then, we have to go back we have to then start to look at the emergence of Black theology. So Black theology, you saw the beginnings of in the writings, for example, of Frederick Douglass, who was questioning this dichotomy. And so it really started to come to head and really got, I would argue, academic discussion, particularly in Black institutions, in the early stages of the civil rights movement, right? So one of the things that emerged during the civil rights movement, which we all tend to think of the Black church, and it did, don't get me wrong, playing a huge role in the civil rights movement. But there was a portion of time during the civil rights movement where there was this tension, right? We think that because he was Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., that he had the full backing of the Black church. That was not the case. There was this silence on race and racial violence by many Black preachers. And I got a typo there, forgive me, but during the civil rights era. And so this is where you started to see the emergence of the Nation of Islam, for example, which was calling into question the notion of Christianity and this dichotomy. And in fact, they labeled it as the white man's religion. And it brought into question, or it brought into light, kind of this philosophical but very practical question. Can you be both Black and a Christian? And then we see the emergence of people like James Cone, before him, Howard Thurman. And I would really, really urge you, if you're not familiar with these two authors, to go read some of their offerings, because they are probably the founders of what we call, or what we know now as Black theology, right? And James Cone in particular, made a very profound argument that, hey, the God as revealed in the scripture and what we know as Christianity identifies with the oppressed. And he makes this argument going all the way back to Exodus with the liberation of the Hebrew slaves, all the way up through the New Testament, when he talks about how Jesus himself was born into a marginalized society under the oppressive system of Roman occupation. So he started to really push this thought that, hey, you can't talk about theology, particularly from a Black perspective, without accounting for this context. And so we see this whole idea of Black theology starting to emerge. So James Cone, again, if you have not read much about him, I would urge you to really do so. I have a little snapshot of his book there. It was really groundbreaking in a lot of ways. James Cone, Black Theology and Black Power, was written in the late 1960s. And his theory was that, yes, Christian theology is about the language of God. He started from that premise. Like all theologian, you have to acknowledge that when you're talking about theology, it is about the language of God. But he made the argument, but there's more than just the language of God. His argument is that it was about the language of God and the liberating characteristics of God as carried out and seen as Jesus Christ, as he called his people into being, into freedom. When Christ came into the world, he announced very early on that he was on earth to set the captives free. And so this was a foundational element of theology, where it is. Cone emphasized that theology is not just about the abstract word, is that you have to look at theology as a culmination of, yes, scripture and understanding it, but it has to be done within the context of one existence, right? So his argument was, if you're going to look at theology under the lens of Black people, that white theology, as he coined it, lacked the vital insights into Black religious thought form, because it did not account for the oppression. It did not account for the lack of freedom as was articulated through predominantly white theological institutions. So he challenged the classic view of theology. And there's a quote there that I love, where he says, therefore, when the master and the slave spoke of God, they could not possibly be referring to the same reality. Because his thought again was that, okay, if you do not account for theology in practical existence, then how then could a white slave master who is oppressing Black people be talking about the same God, when you look at it from the perspective of he is the God who is sent Jesus Christ incarnation to actually liberate people? And so he made this connection between the Bible and the whole idea that, hey, there is a underlying theme within Christianity about liberation and freedom, and there was no accounting for that in his time. And so he then became kind of the thought leader on liberation theology. And so it led me into kind of looking at it. It's like, okay, then going back to his quote about they could not be possibly referring to the same reality. And it got me to thinking about then, what is it about theology? And if you take all of the characteristics that you've talked about to this point into consideration, why is it then that we have this question about God and how does God play out in our lives? And it dawned on me, going back to one of my earlier points about during the civil rights era, it took a while for even the Black churches to endorse and get behind Dr. King and the civil rights movement. But it was very, very telling to me when you read this abstract from Dr. King's letter from the Birmingham City Jail, where this is really kind of an indictment on the church. And the last sentence saying, he was really indicting the church to saying, well, where are you? Where are you in speaking out about injustice? Where are you about speaking up about racism? And he kind of indicts them. Talks about these beautiful churches with their lofty spires pointing towards heaven. But over and over again, I find myself asking, what kind of people worship here? His question then is, who is their God. Because his point was almost the same, I would argue, as James Cone, which is that we can't be talking about the same God if we carry it out and we exercise it in such different fashion when it comes to race. So this is a fundamental thing that I think we have to come to some sort of rationalization about when we're talking about theology and race. And again, if theology is about God, then who is their God? This question by Dr. King, I think, is still prominent today. And so one of the things when I was doing my work at Hood on race and theology, another reference I'm going to give to you tonight, in addition to Howard Thurman and James Cone, is an interesting book. It was really underwritten by Baylor University, but it got documented and captured in this book called America's For God: What We Say About God and What That Says About Us. Because these authors' premise, once again, was that, how you understand God, going back to my earlier portion of the discussion, is very important about understanding somebody's viewpoint. And their perspective is a person's image of God is more important to their worldview than their race, their gender, their class, etc. And so they did a very extensive study, and they did a survey of people across the country, across different denominations. And it was originally conducted back in, I want to say 2007, 2008 timeframe. So some of the data is dated. But they did do an update, I think, in like 2015. But nevertheless, these authors set out to ask two basic questions. To what extent does God interact with the world? And to what extent does God judge the world? Two very profound questions. So they wanted to try and do this study to say, okay, if we can get some insight into how people answer these two questions, we can formulate the role and how people understand God in America. And they came up with this interesting finding, and they grouped them into these 4 areas. And so on the one scale, they look at it from, how strongly do you believe God is engaged in your life? And then on the other scale, they ask the question, well, and how much do you believe God is critical or God is angry? And they came up with this kind of finding, and they grouped them into 4 different areas. And they called them the authoritarian God, type A. Type B is kind of like the benevolent God. And I'm going to go through what each of these mean here in a second. Then you have the critical God, and then you have what they deem as distant God. And their premise was, after looking at all of this data from thousands of surveys and going to different churches and talking to people for several years, that you can probably fit most people into one of these 4 types of categories and how they view God. So the authoritative God, they defined it as you believe that God is both engaged and he's judgmental about what he sees in society. And of all the people that they surveyed, they found that 31% of people kind of fell into this category. And when you looked at the data a little bit even further, you found out that people who believe God was authoritative were predominantly white male evangelicals. Okay. Then you had people who believe that God predominantly manifests his way as a benevolent God, a God who is engaged, but not as judgmental. And you find that they found that about 24% of people fit into this category. And when you look at this perspective, interesting thing here again is, and I'd be very curious to see if they did this study again, how these numbers would shape, because like a lot of things in society, I believe they will probably morph over time. So keep in mind, again, like I said, this was originally done back in the 2007, 2008 timeframe, but they found that most people who believed in a benevolent God were predominantly women and Protestant. And then you had another 24% who believe that God is critical, and that he is judging what he's seeing. He might not be as engaged here on earth, but in the afterlife, God will, in fact, inflict, or there will be justice in the afterlife. And interestingly enough, you found that a large percentage of African American people who are marginalized, people of color, when you look at the data, believe that God was a critical God. And so when you tie this back to some of the things that we've talked about up until this point about the liberation theology of God, I think I found it very interesting because you can start to see a thread here going all the way back to Frederick Douglass, who was condemning Christianity in its form all the way back to the 1860s. And here we were in the early 2000s, and we're finding, I would argue, kind of this thread that extends all the way back, because we still, I do believe, see this prevalent in a lot of Black theology today. This thought that while God may not have inflicted or exact his justice yet, it will occur, and that he's critical. And I couldn't help, as I was reading that, some of this, to hear my grandmother's voice in the background that says, you're going to reap what you sow, boy, and that whole idea of the critical nature of God is, I think, entwined within the Black church's culture. And then the last group was this group of people who didn't feel as though God was judgmental and that he was disengaged. And so you had 16% of the study results, or people who felt as though God existed, but they didn't feel as though he was this judgmental, or that he manifested himself in a lot of our day-to-day activities. They tend to be people who tend to see God as being spiritual, and as a guider of their moral compasses, etc., but not necessarily as engaged day to day. Interestingly enough, the demographics for this group suggested that a lot of people who were in the upper economic class of society tended to view God as distant God. So you had this study, and again, like I said, it's taken from the author Paul Froese and Christopher. I don't have my book with me, but I'll make sure to put it. We'll get it into the chat, or we'll make sure to get it into the notes when they come out in the next few days. But it's a very interesting read. So I say all that to say, if you're trying to put a framework around race and theology, not only do I believe there is a theological underpinning through the works of people like James Cone and Howard Thurman, but I also see this now, like I said, still manifested in some empirical data that we get right here in this study. Very interesting. It's been used by a lot of classes across the country. It's not a hard read. Even though it's used in academia, I will tell you that it's a very interesting read, and I highly recommend it as part of the reading list for this. So with that being said, I am finished tonight with my lecture portion. I didn't think I was going to get through this tonight. So I got a couple of minutes, if I'm not mistaken, Dr. Owens. So why don't we do this, since we got 5 minutes or so left before we close out? Any questions that you want to pose, and I'll just go through the chat, put them in the chat, and I'll try and address them as I see them if we have time. And let me get here. I see there are some comments already in the chat. I hadn't had a chance to look at it. Somebody made a reference to the work of William Jones, Is God a White Racist? Yes, that's also a very good reference. Somebody asked what was the name of Howard Thurman's book that I made a reference to. Great question. So I did not make so Howard Thurman, if you're going to read any of his book, I would recommend you read Howard Thurman, The God of the Oppressed. The God of the Oppressed, written by Howard Thurman. Somebody asked that question. So that's a good book that I would Jesus and the Disinherited is another one. Yes. Yep. So you guys are on it. But God of the Oppressed is a good one also. Excuse me. Anyhow, my goal tonight was to try and link a lot of what we talked about to this point to theology, to show how it still plays a part in what we're still grappling with here today in 2023. And if I were to go back and link it to critical race theory, there are two elements of critical race theory that I would highlight that comes into play when we talk about race and theology tonight. And in fact, if I can just do this, since I got a little bit of time, I'm going to, forgive me, flip all the way back to the beginning, just to show you that I think that when we talk about race and theology as it relates to critical race theory, two things come to mind for me. And that is this whole idea of counter storytelling. I think liberation theology and Black theology is a quintessential example of counter storytelling. And what I mean by that is we would have never, well, never is a very strong word, and I try not to use definitive closed language, but it's highly unlikely that we would have ever gotten liberation theology or even gotten the perspective of Christianity as it relates to Black Americans if it weren't for people like Howard Thurman and James Cone to talk about liberty. So they, in other words, they represented the marginalized, the oppressed of society, and they had to battle. James Cone in particular had to battle to get acceptance, if you will, because he was highly debated when his idea of liberating and liberation theology was first introduced. Howard Thurman talked about this extensively in his book, because it was like, well, a lot of their work was marginalized, called into question, because it didn't fit, if you will, the normative practice of what many in the dominant race consider to be acceptable academic work. That has since, I think, started to shift a little bit, but you still find this element within America that questions the underpinning of their work. But I would argue with you that it is a quintessential example of counter storytelling. critical race theory, I think, would characterize the fact that, hey, we would have never gotten this perspective on Christianity if it weren't for the fact that we had people who had to buck the norm, so to speak, to get this perspective out. So that, and it's also, you could argue that this whole idea of race and in theory and theology fits into the category of intersectionality, right? Because you have this convergence of these two things, racism and theology. So again, trying to link the things back together tonight. So next week, we will move forward. And as I said in the beginning, I will attempt next week to try and combine elements of, or to include some elements of what's listed in week 6 into next week's session, excuse me, so that we can leave some more time in week 6 so we can do exactly what I was trying to do tonight, which is to have some more open dialogue. Because I think, if nothing else, this didactic has taught me that this is a topic of interest and that people have varying perspectives, and I want to allow you an opportunity to, share some of your thoughts. And so I would ask you in the next coming weeks, think about some compelling thoughts that you want to share with the other participants in the seminar and bring them to week 6, and we can have that open dialogue. Okay. With that, I'm going to say good night and thank you again. And I look forward to seeing you all again on November 6th.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Oliver, and thanks to all of you for your attendance tonight. And as we've done in the past, you'll receive the PowerPoint presentation, responses to the questions, the information in the chat in your email inboxes before the next session. So until we meet again, take care of yourselves, and blessings and shalom to each of you. Thank you and good night.